In this video, we're going to use the powers of I pattern to help us evaluate any power of I into this most simplified form. What we see on the left here is your first four powers of I. So I is just I, but I squared, as we know, is -1. I cubed would be I squared times I, which then would be a negative I, because you have -1 times I. And then I to the fourth would be two I squareds being multiplied by each other. So -1 times a -1 is a +1. And these are our first four powers, because if you went down and kept on going down to I to the fifth, that would bring you all the way back up to the top where you'd start. So I to the first is the same as I to the fifth. I to the second is the same as I to the sixth, so on and so forth. So these are the only four powers of I that you're ever going to end up with. So when we ask you to evaluate your powers of I, we want you to simplify down to one of these four options. So first thing that we notice then, once we realize that, is that you have the blue values here versus green. That's because anytime you have I to an odd power, so this would be I to the first here, or I to the third, that's going to be when your power is odd, and you're going to end up with either an I or a negative I. If your power is even, then you have either I squared or I to the fourth, or so on and so forth. You're going to have either a +1 or a -1 as your output. And so that's what we're looking for as we are evaluating. So what we would like you to do is be able to evaluate these without a calculator. Seeing there's only four options for you to have to worry about, you should be able to do so. And since your options are either a positive or negative I or a positive or -1, it's not so bad. So when we look at if the power is odd versus the power is even, you have two different things that you do, but they're similar. If it is odd, you want to first pull out an I and then divide what's left by 2. If it's just even, you're going to divide that power by 2. So let's take a look at a couple quick examples and then talk about some other practice problems. So for instance, if you had I to the 9th, clearly that power is odd, and so we're going to pull out an I, and what's left is I to the 8th, because I to the 8th times I is I to the 9th. So you take whatever's left here, this I to the 8th, you divide 8 by 2, and then you have that 4 here. So that we're using our powers, or our properties of exponents rather, to help us simplify this. So I squared to the fourth, you have a power, so you multiply, and so that is I to the 8th. The reason we do this is because we know that I squared is a -1. And so since I squared is a -1, you can rewrite this as just -1 to the fourth, and you're still being multiplied by that I. And powers of -1 are pretty simple. Anytime this power is even, you're going to end up with a +1, as we do in this example here. But if this power was odd, then this would be a -1. Now, again, this is even, so -1 to the fourth power is going to be a +1. You're still multiplying it by that I, so 1 times I is just I, and that brings us back to here. Now, another example, if our power was even instead, you have I to the 12th. There's no reason that you have to pull out an I like we did in our previous example, and so all you need to do is just divide that power by 2. And so I to the 12th, divide that by 2, that's I squared times 6. 2 times 6 is equal to 12. And so I squared is a -1. And of course, -1 to the 6th power, since 6th power is even, -1 to an even power is going to be a +1. Here are 3 examples to practice with. As you can see, we have 3 problems. One of them has an even exponent. These bottom 2 have an odd exponent, and so that tells us what type of answer we should expect to get. All we need to do is figure out if it's a positive or negative version. So please pause the video and allow yourself some time to practice, and then we'll go over these answers together. So to start with, we see that we have I to the 48th. That's an even exponent, and so we know it's either going to be 1 or -1. We don't have to pull out an I. All we need to do is divide 48 by 2. When we do so, we see that we have 2 times 24, which is equal to 48. So that works out as equivalent, but that's helpful because now we know that I squared is equal to a -1. So we really have -1 to the 24th, and since -1 to an even exponent is going to be a positive number, this just pans out to be a +1. Whereas for our second example, you do have an odd number, so you do need to pull out the I part first, and so we start with that. So you have I to the 26th times I, which of course is 27 when you multiply those together by properties of exponents. 26 is now the even part. You're going to divide 26 by 2, and so that you have 13 out in the exponent, so I squared to the 13th. Again, I squared is -1, so you have -1 to the 13th. Now this is an odd exponent, so that just is equal to -1. -1 times I is a negative I. Our last example, we have I to the 53rd, also an odd exponent, so you need to pull an I out like we did before. And as you do so, what you end up with is I to the 52nd times I, and then that adds up to 53. 52 divided by 2 is a 26, so you have I squared to the 26th. I squared is -1 again. -1 to an even exponent is a +1. +1 times I is a positive I. So all of these answers are going to boil down to one of these four options.